É Tudo Verdade 2022, 27º Festival Internacional de Documentários. Os melhores documentários do Brasil e do mundo em mostras competitivas e programas especiais. Gratuito de 31 de março a 10 de abril. Em salas de São Paulo e Rio de Janeiro. E online para todo o país. Confira a programação em www.etudoverdade.com.br.
Oi, bem-vindas e bem-vindos a essa que é a terceira mesa da 19ª Conferência Internacional do Documentário, uma correalização do Itaú Cultural e do É Tudo Verdade. Neste ano, nós estamos discutindo clássicos do patrimônio da história do documentário. Nesse segundo dia, nós vamos estar realizando duas mesas em torno dos 80 anos da viagem para rodar no Brasil o inacabado Tudo, por Orson Welles. Não deve surpreender ninguém que MYRON MEISEL, nosso convidado da mesa de hoje, tenha uma extensa e destacada carreira como crítico de cinema antes de seu encontro marcado com um dos mais importantes filmes inacabados de Orson Welles. MEISEL escreveu monografias para retrospectivas do MoMA, o Museu de Arte Moderna de Nova York, sobre Blake Edwards, John Cassavetes e Michael Curtiz, e cumpriu também papel essencial em revistas de cinema como Focus e The Film Journal. O primeiro filme dele como produtor, ainda nos anos 70, foi um retrato do cineasta Nicholas Ray, I Am a Stranger Here Myself. E ele produziu ainda, em 1992, The Chaplin Puzzle, sobre o início da carreira cinematográfica do criador de Carlitos. Ao lado de seu colega de crítica, Bill Krohn, e de Richard Wilson, o braço direito de Welles, durante as filmagens de It's All Tudo, assim como também de tantas outras, como A Dama de Xangai, mas ele co-dirigiu, co-escreveu e co-produziu, em 1993, It's All True, based on an unfinished film by Orson Welles, pioneiramente tornando visível a primeira visão global do que Catherine Benamou, também colaboradora no filme, definiu como a Odisseia Pan-Americana de Orson Welles no título de seu livro seminal sobre It's All True, que é esse aqui. Ainda inédito em português, infelizmente. Nos 80 anos da jornada brasileira de Welles, é um privilégio receber MEISEL na conferência para relembrar a realização de seu premiado documentário, já exibido nessa semana pelo festival, que o celebra em seu próprio título. So, it is an honor to welcome MYRON MEISEL to our International Documentary Conference to discuss a bit the two shootings. One, 80 years ago, It's So True by Orson Welles here. The other, almost 30 years ago, when MYRON, with Bill Krohn and Dick Wilson, co-directs a film about that trip. That's called It's So True, a film based on It's So True, based on an unfinished film by Orson Welles. MYRON, thank you so much for being here with us. It's a pity it is still a virtual conference. We are doing that for the third year, due to the pandemic. We have to keep this online, but it's a pleasure to see you again.
The same for me. You know, it's very important to always use the subtitle of this particular film because it is not really Orson Welles' It's All True. It is, in that sense, and Orson might appreciate this, an imposter film. It is based upon his film, but we understood very early that the worst thing we could possibly try to do would be to imitate it. We could not make the film that he would have made. So the question was to make a film out of what he shot and make it as true to his vision as we could without endeavoring to imitate his vision. And the reason we went to Brazil is we felt we needed to shoot more footage in order to more fully convey the message that Orson Welles wished to communicate back in 1942.
And what this was going to be one of my last questions, but will be the second of the first. What message was that?
Well, that's a very complex question, which has because like Harry Lime, Orson Welles in Brazil was impersonating many roles. His primary purpose, and the reason he was sent there, was a mission that was political in nature. This is very ill understood in this country because the role of South America in World War II is very poorly misunderstood by your neighbors to the north. This was a project commissioned by the State Department, by Undersecretary of State Nelson Rockefeller. And the purpose was part of an overall diplomatic effort to ensure that Brazil entered the conflict as an ally of the United States and its allies, rather than remain neutral, and also at the same time to persuade Argentina not to ally with the Axis, but to remain neutral. And this was very, very critical to the relatively early victory, primarily by the British fleet, in winning the War of the Seas in the Atlantic relatively early on. Then, on the other hand, there was the costume which Orson Welles wore on this mission, which was to be a cultural ambassador and to not only represent our country to Mexico and Brazil, but also to represent the cultures of Mexico and Brazil back to the United States in what Orson regarded as a positive and honest light. His honesty was not well appreciated in the United States of 1942. That's a short answer to your question.
That is a short answer, but it's a good starting point. I would love to let's go back a little bit. How about the starting point of your documentary? In 1985, I think it was 85, Fred Chandler found 300 cans of negatives of It's So True at the Paramount archives. That is in the film.
It was actually the stock footage library.
The stock footage library. Yeah. Oh, take a look. It was a stock footage library. And that info is in the film, of course, is in your film. How did you become involved in working on a feature documentary about It's So True?
Well, first I have to address the issue of Fred Chandler discovering the footage.
Please.
For many political reasons within Paramount, we had to keep it a secret as to when the year the footage was discovered. So there is a very curious irony about the narration in our movie, It's All True, because actually within the movie, the very first word of the narration and the very last word of the narration happened to be lies. The last lie about Fred Chandler was intentional, and that was for diplomatic purposes at the time, mostly to protect Fred. The other lie, which was actually a mistake, was we identify the opening shot as being the premiere of Citizen Kane in Hollywood. It is in fact the New York premiere, but we got the footage from the stock footage library mislabeled. And frankly, the last 2 weeks of post-production, I was sleeping less than 2 hours a night, and we were tired and harried and careless, and I did not catch that mistake of the label, for which we were roasted very hard in New York for what was to them a very obvious mistake, and I could only plead human frailty for it. But I suppose we can reveal the date. Fred Chandler discovered it now, and I can admit to the first and last words being inaccurate in the narration. So let me get back to your question.
But you didn't reveal the date. It was not 985. When was it?
I no longer recall, but it was earlier.
Earlier than that.
It was important not to let people know that he had found it earlier at the time. I unfortunately forget the details.
But that's okay. But how did you become involved in the film?
Well, let me start with the history of the project. Originally, when the footage was discovered, Orson was still alive. Orson was approached about undertaking the finishing of the film, which he flatly refused to do, saying the film was cursed. And later on, he elaborated slightly by saying that he felt after the release of Black Orpheus that had accomplished many of the things concerning Samba he had wished to attempt in his own film. And he felt that after Black Orpheus, it was no longer as fresh or important to do so.
That's very interesting.
Nevertheless, Richard Wilson was determined to see this through. And it was Dick Wilson who initiated the project and shepherded it for many years. The footage that Dick directed in the film are essentially most of the English language interviews. Those were all directed by Richard in the 80s and were used to create a promotional film, which I believe ran about 18 minutes. And that was meant to try to stir up interest of financial people to back the project. It did not help. Subsequent to that, Bill Krohn, who was an old friend of mine, I should mention that Bill has an extraordinary talent for maintaining friendships. Bill invited me over and said, "Would you like to look at Orson's footage from It's All True?" And I said, "Can I jump in my car and drive right over?" And so they put on about an hour's worth on a VHS tape of the footage that was being that was then in the custody of the UCLA Film Archive, on whose board I presently sit. And so I watched it, and the first thing I said to Bill before I watched it is, all the histories so far talk about how Orson's footage was incoherent and could not be cut together. And so Bill says, "Well, tell me what you think, watch." So I'm watching, and first of all, it's beautiful footage. The shots are marvelous and lovely. But I'm also looking at it, and as a filmmaker, I am startled, puzzled, and then furious, because it is transparently obvious to me that not only does this cut together, but there are a number of possible ways of coherently cutting it together, and that it was an absolute canard and falsehood attributed to Welles that this was incompetent, unusable footage. I could see how this fit together. In fact, I could see alternate ways. There were choices, and they all worked. And this got me very jazzed up. And so Bill asked me to come on to the project and see what I could do to get it made. Now, Bill and Dick had been working on it, I believe, about 2 years before that time. So I came on, and it took us another 7 to get the picture done. So I have had my own obsession with this project, but I am pleased to say, I hope accurately, that I've learned to let go of the obsession. Because when Oya and Gary Graver asked me to try to do the same thing with Other Side of the Wind, I answered, I've given 7 years of my life to Orson Welles. I want some of it for myself.
And but it's great that you, as a Brazilian, I can tell you, it's great that you did it, focusing It's All True. You told us that when you came aboard, Dick Wilson and Bill had been working for around 2 years on the project. I had never seen, but I read that there is a 22-minute short film directed by Dick Wilson and Fred Chandler, called It's All True, 4 Men on a Raft. That would be just about the Jangadeiros episodes.
Well,
Did you remember? Do you remember having seen this short film?
Of course.
That,
it was the first thing I watched after the raw footage. And,
great.
But there's a misunderstanding about that. That was never intended to be a film unto itself. It was essentially what we call in Hollywood a sizzle reel, which was intended as a promotional trailer to attract financial interest. There was no, Dick would have been mortified for somebody to consider that a completed film in itself. It was essentially an extended trailer.
Great. Do you remember? It's interesting that it's an American-French co-production, and there are some.
I mean, to be accurate, although we were Americans making the movie, the money was entirely French.
Entirely, that was what I was going to ask you, because it's we have the ministry, we have Canal Plus, we have the film. It was a French production of an American for 3 American directors. Bill Krohn was important to get that money, to get the French on board.
Yes, he found them. No, Bill was the one who found them. We all had to sell them. But it was the Balenciaga design company which had set up a film unit, and the head was Regine Conquier, and the person who actually ran the company essentially as an executive producer, was Jean-Luc Ormier.
Mhm. I was curious about to understand the French part of this. I wonder, you told us that most of the American interviews were shot still in the 80s by Richard Wilson.
That's correct.
Yeah, and but I would and I remember that unfortunately Dick Wilson was unable to watch the film when it was ready because he died in 1991. I think 2 years before the film was released, at least.
Yes, and before the deal had been concluded to make the film. It was extremely difficult to persuade Paramount to let the film be made.
Even at that time, even half a century later, after all the
Oh yes,
problems?
no. Paramount was extremely recalcitrant about it. Basically, we're going to them and we're saying, if you let us use this footage in your stock footage library, then we will give you a marketable film for free, and you don't have to spend a penny. I thought that was pretty persuasive. They did not.
That was a good pitch. Yeah, a very good pitch. They didn't buy it. Yeah.
No, and I had some supporters within Paramount, but unfortunately, executives leave companies. And every time I enlisted an important ally who could help make it happen, they ended up in a job somewhere else. And as is customary, and I've learned this in many projects in dealing with the studios, it is the business affairs lawyers who throw up all the barriers, obstacles, and difficulties. I can't remember if it was just before Dick died or just after. But Stanley Jaffe was in charge of the studio. And he had been a producer and had worked with Jodie Foster on The Accused, for which she won the Academy Award and was a great success. And by coincidence, my wife was hired as the first production president of Jodie Foster's movie company, Egg Pictures. So I asked Jodie for a favor. And Jodie called Stanley Jaffe. And Stanley Jaffe said, "This is a wonderful idea," and instructed the business affairs department to go ahead and make the deal.
Oh, gosh.
It still took 2 more years after that to conclude the contract. And luckily, Stanley Jaffe also left the company, but he was succeeded by Sherry Lansing, who was his partner on producing the Jodie Foster picture. And Sherry was extremely supportive. But the business affairs people have a mind of their own. And I've discovered this at other studios as well. They often consider their job to ignore their boss's directives in the pursuit of every small advantage they can possibly make. There's a bit of an amusing story. At one point, this was before I was able to importune Jodie to intervene on our behalf, where I was sitting in the office of the main lawyer. And he looked at me and said, look, there's no point in persisting in this. This project is dead here. It will never come alive. And I just want you to understand that and accept it. And then he paused and he looked at me and he says, but something is telling me I haven't seen the last of you. And he was right. Now I'm going to tell a tale out of school, which I am only daring to do because this is largely an international rather than a domestic broadcast. But the surname of my bête noire, through all these years of difficult negotiation, happened to be named Madoff. And I don't know if you know that name.
Of course we know.
But the world works in strange ways. I'll give you a little detail just of the lawyerly negotiations that were conducted to give you an idea of the frustration involved. Because the essential concept of the deal is that the French would put up the money, and in return, they would have distribution rights in half the world. And Paramount would give us permission to use the stock footage, and they would get the other half of the world. Pretty straightforward, but not in a negotiation. The French producers told me, we would like the territory of Libya because the US has an embargo and Paramount cannot do business in Libya. So the response I got from the Paramount lawyer was, all right, they can have Libya. We want Germany and Italy in return. Now, that's pretty absurd. Mm-hmm. But that will give you the flavor of how hard it was to make this happen.
Yeah. And returning to Dick Wilson, how much of the, I'm thinking that it's obvious that first of all, he was a witness. He was there with Welles. Second, he was very close to the project of making a film, making visible the footage of Welles. But unfortunately, he died before the film.
Yes, and incidentally, an extraordinarily talented filmmaker in his own right.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the difficulties is Orson refused to acknowledge Dick for many, many years for two reasons. One, Dick and his wife Betty were starting a family, and so they declined to go into exile with Orson to make Othello. And secondly, Dick, having a successful career in the studio system, evoked an enormous amount of jealousy on Orson's part.
No, that's interesting to know. But Dick knowing that, it's especially gracious from Dick that he went back to work with Itaú to make to pay tribute to the astonishing work.
There are two things about Richard that you should understand. One is that he remained fantastically loyal to Orson, irrespective of whatever Orson did. It didn't matter what Orson did. It didn't change Richard's feelings. And Richard started his career in film working on this project, as did his wife.
His wife, yeah.
And therefore, their emotional investment in both the project and the mission of the project remained undiminished all those years, even as Orson had moved his interest elsewhere. Now, to be fair to Orson, He did not make another movie, nor even appear in one until Jane Eyre in 1944. And that was because he devoted 2 years of his life after returning from South America, trying to finish this film on his own. So Orson gave it his best yeoman effort, and then he had to move on.
And back to Richard Wilson. When he passed away, the film, you had started already to editing the film. You had a script to the film. How developed was the film? None of that was done.
Nothing that you're speaking of had commenced. Basically, what happened is when Dick died, Bill and I essentially needed to take over the task of producing, writing, and directing the picture. And so it fell to us to pick up the baton from the fallen warrior and do it not only to honor Orson, but to honor the memory of Richard Wilson as well.
The film is dedicated to his memoir, right? His memory.
I don't remember anymore.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think the film.
We were very scrupulous in giving him billing ahead of us.
Yeah. Oh, that was quite generous.
This was something that I insisted on as a condition of doing the project.
Right. And it is very interesting. Then you told us that they started the shooting of the film started in LA during the 80s by Dick Wilson with making interviews with some of the American witnesses that were still alive. I wondered how was organized the shooting in Brazil? When did you came to Brazil? How long? It was 1991, 1990.
No, we were in Brazil in January of 1993.
1993.
And I believe we left January 2nd. No, we had to have left January 3rd because I'm sure you Brazilians are accustomed to the bureaucratic red tape of the Brazilian government.
Mm. You bet.
And at the last minute, we still hadn't had our visas issued. So I remember on January 2nd, going to the Brazilian consulate in Los Angeles and refusing to leave until I had the visas in hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the only reason we got the visas is that I had the official phone my stockbroker who had to vouch that I was a man of good economic character.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I have to thank her for being so persuasive.
And
see, many people contribute to this film, even though they don't know it.
Yeah. And you came in early January 1993. Bill came with you. Did you came together?
Yeah, Bill, Gary, and myself came together.
Gary being Gary Graver, the cinematographer of the film, and the cinematographer of most of the films that was made in the last 20 years of his life. And we can see Gary in the footage in the other side of the wind. He shot also for Fakens. And let's talk about Gary a bit later. First, I think it's interesting to understand your trip to Brazil. How long did you stay here? Because you came to Rio and and to Fortaleza, right?
Well, we were in Fortaleza for most of the shoot.
Oh,
In fact, we did shoot footage we spent 3 days shooting footage in Rio, but I'm not sure any of that is in the final cut. So I think virtually everything we shot was that ended up in the film is in Fortaleza.
how long had you been in Fortaleza?
We were in
For how long?
Fortaleza for 3 weeks and a couple of days.
Something like that. But there are some photos that was shot in Rio, because I believe the interviews with Grande Otelo.
Oh, of course. Of course.
And
You remind
Amperi
me.
Ribeiro.
Yes, that was
that
all
was shot-
done in the Opera House. Yes, that was in Rio. I made a mistake of memory.
It
Of
was
course,
shot
that was done in Rio.
no Teatro do Municipal, yes?
Yes.
And that was shot
And
in Rio.
I have to thank Jean-Luc for getting us the location.
Mhm. He
Uh,
came up with the idea of shooting it at the Teatro Municipal. Jean-Luc.
No.
No.
Jean-Luc didn't come up with ideas, but he did make ideas happen.
Happened, right? Yes. He's a yeah, like a good producer. It makes it turns it possible. An idea make possible. And you shot with Grande Otelo and Peri Ribeiro and Rio, and with Francisca Moreira da Silva, the young bride in Jangadeiros. You shot her in Fortaleza.
We shot a lot of other people in the Teatro
Of
Municipal
course.
as well.
As well, yeah.
No, I'm trying to remember the names. We shot with, oh dear, this is a problem at my age where you reach for the name and it runs away from you instead of towards you.
Yeah, no problem.
Perry Rivero's father's name was
Edivelto
Martins. Well, we
Mhm.
talked to Martins' granddaughter.
Mhm.
It was quite wonderful, and we actually staged some dance sequences and a lot of interesting material, but it did not fit into the compact running time we had to end up with. And very helpful was Carlos, the singer, very popular singer.
Carlos Lira?
Yes, his wife was on set.
Yeah.
She was extreme.
Kate Lira.
Kate, yes,
Lira,
Kate. Yes, she made a very big difference in making the day shoot go well.
Oh, great to know. And both Bill and you conducted the interviews, or just you? Or you were together doing the
Well, well, I'll pull back the curtain and tell you who did what.
Yeah, great.
All right. All the shots were set up by me.
Mm-hmm.
So the camera work, the setups, that was all me. The interviews were conducted by Bill with the obvious essential participation of Catherine Benham.
Catherine was with you doing the shooting.
Oh, absolutely, and indispensable, because we had a serious logistical difficulty in that no one understood the Jangadeiros language except Catherine on the crew.
Oh.
None of the Brazilians.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody made a wisecrack about the film that is very funny because it is very accurate. They said, only you guys would make a Brazilian film that even the Brazilians need subtitles for.
I can understand the quote.
So what we learned the first day of shooting very quickly is that having Catherine on set as translator was extremely cumbersome, and it was very difficult, as well as using a great deal of film and processing and so forth, because the movie was shot on film. And it wasn't best for the flow of the interviews or to get the best material out of the subjects. So we had a wonderful sound man from France, the only French member of our crew, Jean-Pierre Rieu, who's worked with many, many of the greatest French directors, and is unfortunately deceased. But he essentially invented a remote control system where Catherine would be 10 or 20 feet away from the set in a secure location where you couldn't hear her. And she had an earpiece and would translate into an earpiece that Bill was wearing. And in this way, we were able to conduct the interviews in a smooth and intimate fashion. And it was essential to getting the kind of candor and stimulating long suppressed memories from people. With the translation process, that was not helpful. But with the system that Jean-Pierre devised, we were able to get people to remember things that they had not thought of in decades.
In decades, yeah. Because it's important, I think, for all audience to remember that Otelo, Grande Otelo, Peri Ribeiro, all the families of the jangadeiros that we can see in the film, for decades, they haven't seen any footage of the film. It's important. It's interesting to think about that. Some of the families, and I think about probably Francisca, she never again. Francisca Moreira da Silva, that you shot in a lovely interview in Fortaleza. Probably
we actually had to shoot her twice because we shot her the first day and the location was beautiful. But by the time we came back to the location later in the day, we ended up with unusable footage and had to shoot her a second time.
But when I was thinking that probably she had never seen herself in a film, because probably
I don't think any of them had.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to address some issues about documentary filmmaking as they came up in the course of this shoot. And I think it will contradict some of the myths people believe about how documentaries are made. One thing is that after the long day shooting around 11 o'clock or midnight before we went to bed, Bill, Catherine, and I would get together usually in my room, and we would go over who we were interviewing the next day and what their stories would be, so that we would have an idea what to expect when we went out to shoot. And then we would go out the next day, and at the end of the day's shoot, every story was completely different than what we had expected. This happened every single day. So not once, for all our preparation, did any of the stories match what we got on film. The preparation was nevertheless invaluable, but it was also teaching us regular lessons. The other thing that was interesting is we would go into people's homes, which were usually a single room with a dirt floor in the favela. And we would talk to people about their long deceased relatives with whom they had lived their entire lives together in the same room. And as each individual was interviewed, telling their own story, everyone else in the family expressed enormous surprise and even shock because none of them had ever told one another about their own stories. So in a sense, the camera crew coming in was digging up buried memories that had never been shared before.
Yeah. We can, watching the film, we have this impression that almost everybody there, that they are, you know, revisiting a part of their story or their family story, his story, almost for the first time. You know,
Precisely for the first time.
Precisely for the first time. But you know, for a camera, precisely for the first time. But it's very interesting that they are. I remember seeing. It is interesting to know that you shot twice with Francesca, because it is very strong to see Francesca remembering how she was selected to be in the film by Welles, etc., etc., etc. And it doesn't look like that she had told that story as many times as you could imagine, because she was, she was.
But she was the only person we talked to who actually was telling us the story for the second time.
For this, yeah.
And I have to tell you, she was very unhappy about it.
Why?
And well, she wanted to be paid more money to do it again.
Mm.
And she was very demanding. And I told her that the most generous amount we could pay her was whatever the number was. And she shook her finger at me and called me hombre muy duro.
Yeah.
But she agreed.
Had you paid for every interview in the film?
Well, my memory is, I believe we tried to pay everybody something. Our budget was very tight.
Do you remember around what? How it was $500,000, $1 million?
Well, that's a bit of a sore point. In addition to my other duties on the film, was also the production accountant. But I actually never saw the final budget, which the French never showed to me. So I don't know how much it actually cost.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know what I spent.
And I'm not going to ask you how much did you spend or any estimative. I mean,
to be frank, you know, it was terribly complicated because the French were not reliable in their cash flow. So we would have interruptions in post-production where I would have to explain to the crew that the money hadn't arrived and I couldn't pay them for that week. But I think between my blunt candor and not bullshitting them, and their own sense of devotion and loyalty to the project, you know, nobody left. We all kept working, and the money came. I mean, the French were ultimately reliable, but with many, many bumpy parts. And I was always explaining to them that whenever they were late with the money, everything would end up costing more.
More, of course.
Well, you say, of course, but they did not.
I've been also a producer for too long, Milo. I haven't for too long, and I would like to ask you about another two Brazilians that helped you and Bill to make the film. There are two very important Brazilian filmmakers that they have the credit is that they were assistant directors, and I'm telling their names are, of course, Davi Neves, a very famous director from the Cinema Novo, and Rogério Sganzella, himself a director of two films about It's So True. At that time, he had done Nem Tudo é Verdade and A Linguagem de Orson Welles. Do you remember how did Davi Neves and Rogério were approached to work with you?
Well, I think that was largely through Bill and Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say that especially Rogério was an extraordinarily generous friend to the production. And we became very close during the shooting, and you couldn't ask for a more supportive individual. You knew that if you ever needed help from him, he would always be there. Now, frankly, I don't remember them getting credits as assistant directors because they did not assist in the direction. David Neves was essentially the unit production manager, and Rogério was simply a wonderful and indispensable friend who did many, many things. But neither of them were assistant directors on it.
Yeah, that's my curiosity came from that, because in the end credits that I saw last night, there they are, assistant directors Davi Neves and Rogério Sganzella, and I was a bit surprised because
I am frankly surprised, but I have nothing but goodwill towards them, so I'm not complaining.
Great. And
I should mention that David Neves's father, who was in the diplomatic corps for Brazil, was an exceptional supporter of the production, which is how David came onto it.
Great.
And we were often, I believe he was stationed in Hong Kong at the time. And I would make many calls to Hong Kong to talk to him before we went to Brazil.
Before you came to Brazil.
Yes, and his connections and cooperation were very, very important. It's necessary to understand that I walked into this project knowing very little. I knew some Brazilian history, but I did not know much about Brazil. So I was learning every day. I had a very open mind, but it was easy to be open when it was so empty.
And did Rogério Sganzella, did he accompany, he was with you in the set, with you and Bill and Gary doing the interviews, or he was?
No. To the best of my recollection, Rogério was not in Fortaleza. Rogério was with us in Rio.
But in Rio, when you shot with Grande Otelo and Pedro Ribeiro?
Oh, he was there. Yes, definitely.
He was there. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and he was even driving us around. I remember riding in the back of Rogério's car with Grande Otelo sitting on my lap in the back. And it was very interesting to feel his body because he's very light. It was not heavy at all.
Yeah. That was.
But it was actually a sort of intimacy that I value remembering.
And I remember Grande Otelo. Grande Otelo always. You were a witness of that. Grande Otelo was always very, very kind when he was talking about Orson Welles. In the interviews of the films, I met Grande Otelo. I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times. One of them, I think he went to present with you a screening of the film. I don't know if he were with you abroad, but he went to France for the screening of this of It's So True, and he was very yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. I didn't know it.
Yeah, he was a special guest in a film festival. It was the last time I met him, because as you know, he died a little not so long after the premiere of the film. But I remember him in the film, and I remember him telling me he had seen your film, and he was very glad to see that. Oh, finally they are telling the story of how Orson loved Brazil.
Well, I cannot tell you how much it warms my heart to hear that is so. That pleases me enormously, and I didn't know that.
No.
I'm telling you many things that I have never spoken of before today, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I hope you keep doing it.
Well, I'm banking on the passage of time, making everything all right. Grande Otelo was extremely suspicious of our project and at first refused to participate. And he had his reasons. I think he felt he had heard this so many times before. Why should he believe anyone? And so we went to his house and we sat together in his kitchen. And then I discovered that he spoke Spanish. And I speak enough Spanish. So it turned out our common language was Spanish. So we spent more than an hour and a half just talking at his kitchen table in Spanish about Orson and about himself. And at the end of it, we had won his trust, and he was happy to participate. But it took a great deal of romancing and a personal connection in order to
engage him.
Yes.
Yeah, I can understand.
But once he was in, he was a complete professional.
Yeah, no, yeah.
And Perry Rivero could not have been more. He was ready to do anything at any time, and you could ask him to do anything, and he would just do it. He was just a complete pro.
He was a great guy and a great singer.
Very, very sweet man.
Yeah, it's a pity we lost him so early. And I would like to ask you about the engagement of Gary Graver in your crew, because it's amazing that you got Graver. That was
there was no way we wouldn't have him. I'd known Gary for years before then. He was a friend, and he was never asked to join the project. He just called me on the phone and say, "When do you need me? I'm there." Gary was like that.
I made an interview with him here 25 years ago.
You never needed to ask Gary anything. He would volunteer before you asked.
Do you remember if he told you anything about the memories that Orson had of the shooting in Brazil?
Well, he told me many, many memories he had of Orson, but nothing about the Brazil shoot. I don't think they discussed it.
Yeah, because when I made an interview with Gary here in Brazil, I asked him about that, and he didn't. I don't know if he didn't want to talk about this.
No,
if he really haven't an idea.
Gary was a guileless person. He would talk about anything, so he really just didn't know. And one of the reasons. Part of the reason, of course, that he wanted to be involved in the project was to continue his relationship of love with Orson. But also, I think he wanted to learn about the Brazilian shoot because he knew so little about it. So, and that was my motivation as well. So Gary and I were busy learning together every day. Gary was extremely easy to work with. We had a bit of a game, which used to particularly annoy Bill, which is we would craft a secret language where we would use lyrics from rock songs from the Doors or the Clash and use them to refer to f-stops or lenses or various things about the camera. And this way we could talk in this secret code and we would understand each other instantly, but nobody else knew what we were talking about. At one point, Bill got very angry because, oh gosh, I think it was probably around Grande Othello. Somebody who was very short in stature was standing by. And Gary and I used to call the shortest f-stop the Billy Barty because it was so short. And when Gary said to me, Billy Barty, I said, yeah, Billy Barty.
Right.
And Bill thought we were insulting Grande Othello with his height.
Yeah. I can imagine the experience of shooting with Gary.
Well, I can tell you another little production type story. What would often happen is the crew would break for lunch and Gary and I wouldn't go. And we would, just the two of us would go off shooting shots. I would do the slating. And we got more shots done in 20 minutes than we did in 3 hours with the whole crew.
Yeah.
And then we would come to lunch and there would be so many people eating, we would say, these are many more people than were on the set. Who are all these people?
Yeah.
But we seem to be feeding. We also had a lot of serendipitous encounters while shooting. We were shooting on the beach at Fortaleza with the rafts on the water. And somebody had an old man walk by and he said, what are you doing? And we explained. And he said, oh, I was in that movie. And we interviewed him for a while and we looked through this footage and we found him. He was telling the truth.
The truth.
You know, there's another famous story that we debunked. It was reported in the New York Times that a shark had been found who had eaten jacare. This is, you can still find it online in the New York Times. And we actually found the old fisherman who had captured the shark. And we talked to him and he said, oh yes, there was a man inside the shark, but he was 5 inches taller than jacare. It was not he. But in the New York Times, the newspaper of record, this is the true story.
That's the true story. Yeah. And I'm wondering how also you finished shooting in Brazil, back to America. You had to organize the material. And that is, of course, that wasn't easy because first of all, there were no script. Orson Welles never wrote a script for H02. He wrote some memorandum with some ideas. He spoke about some ideas or wrote some letters about how he would be editing this or that. But probably you. Well,
he didn't need notes to know how he was going to edit.
He didn't need. Yeah.
He didn't need it.
Yeah, but
now David Meltzer, who was on set in 1942, did write a lot of scripted material, but it was entirely about Rio and Samba. And there was, but only fragments of that survived, and not enough of the carnival footage survived to even try to match those fragments. It was just not usable. But I will tell you an interesting post-production fact. I presume you have heard of the Avid technology for editing.
Of course.
Well, It's All True was only the second feature in history to use the technology. We were essentially the beta testers of the Avid equipment. And in early 1993, Avid was very avid to prove that their equipment was good. So they were exceptionally helpful, but shall we say, it was a primitive early version of the technology. And the hard drives on which we stored the footage were about 2 feet wide and 4 feet long, very heavy, and they held very little data. We actually had to rent 3 closets in order to keep all the hard drives we needed. And every day, whenever we stopped work, we had to download all the data off the machine onto a hard drive in order to clear it to put more data back in the next day. It was very cumbersome, very bulky, very bulky. But the project would have been impossible without it.
Without that.
Because the footage that we used in the film and which we intercut included 35 nitrate, 35 safety, Super 16, 16 millimeter, and high 8. And then, of course, there was also the Technicolor issues.
Of course.
So without even this primitive nonlinear system for editing the project, if that technology had not been there, it would have taken us many years of laborious manual labor to accomplish the same result on a steam bag.
The editor was Ed Marks, right?
Yes, very much so.
Very much so. I think this was the very first film that he edited.
Well, there's a story behind that too. The original editor on the project was Monty Hellman. And Monty was the one who looked at the footage in the lab and told us our first day of shooting was unusable in that location, which is how we knew we had to reshoot. But the problem we had with Monty is Monty worked for 4 days assembling the footage and said, "Here it is, it's done." And we said, "Monty, that's amazing. You did that in 4 days. What a terrific cut. The problem is, this is not the film we want to make. It requires more effort." And Monty says, "But you don't understand. I'm in love." And he had fallen in love with a French woman, who, as it turned out, he later married and stayed married to for the rest of his life. But when Monty left the picture, Ed, who was the only person who actually knew how to operate the equipment,
I thought
we promoted him to full editor, and it was an extraordinary piece of good luck because, as Ed used to say, I never want to just be a pair of hands. I want to be a cutter. And Ed had magnificent instincts, terrific ideas. was absolutely dedicated. Unlike most editors, he could be a bit of a diva, which is very uncommon. But it was worth it because the same temperament that he occasionally exhibited was also the temperament that gave him such great talent. To the degree that the picture is an artistic success, you have to give Ed Marks equal credit with the rest of us.
I was wondering if, because in fact we have the film. You can divide the film in two parts. The first part would be a documentary about it, so true, and the second part is mostly devoted to screening what was possible to the reconstitution possible, the dramatical reconstitution possible of jangadeiros, right?
Yes.
Hopefully we have 45 minutes of a documentary and 45 minutes of this. And what I was trying to think is, we had before that 22-minute version of Jangadeiros made by Fred and Dick.
Mostly Dick.
Mostly Dick.
Yes.
Now Dick is missing. He's not in the picture anymore. And what I want to ask you,
in our minds, he was always in the picture, but he
was always in the but
he's not physically present.
Yeah. But Ed Marks, he was the guy who recut that part of Jangadeiros and made it.
No, it wasn't like that at all. No, we made no reference to the short in any way.
Yeah.
None of the cutting in the feature bears any relationship to the
other
promotional film.
Yeah, but who edited that part? It was Dick Wilson. The 45-minute sequence. Well,
no, Dick because he was no longer with us, had nothing to do with the editing.
Then what I'm wondering is, then it was Bill, and the editing was you and Bill were working with Ed Marks daily while doing the editing.
Well, it would be more accurate to say that Ed Marks and we were essentially always in the room together. Sometimes Ed would say, "Let me spend some time with this." And he would work alone for 3 or 4 hours. One of the best examples is the cut of the blessing of the animals in the Bonito sequence. That was actually done overnight by Ed by himself.
Oh.
And it was so thrilling to come back to the next morning and see that.
I see that, yeah. But, and you correct me, but I think it was the first time that footage was ever screened, right? Because Norman Foster made that.
I believe so. Now, Norman Foster directed it, but Welles's instructions were quite copious in detail.
For the Bonito sequence, yeah.
So that it was actually directed by Norman, but he was very reliable in executing Orson's instructions.
Yeah, it's quite clear when we watch, especially when we can in your film watch Jangadeiro, the Jangadeiro sequence, that Orson was very influenced by Robert Flaherty, and the Bonito story was originally written by Flaherty, if I'm not wrong.
Yes,
I think that for the whole project, Flaherty was kind of an inspiration to Wells. doing
Yes, but
shooting. It's so true. Yeah.
you're correct, but I believe you could also overemphasize that. Personally, having lived with the footage as much as I have,
Mm-hmm.
I see a great deal more influence of Eisenstein and John Ford.
Yeah, Eisenstein is, of course, yeah.
And there's no question in my mind, in 1939,
Mm-hmm.
there was a version of Que Viva Mexico
Mm-hmm.
in a cut by Alexandrov
Mm-hmm.
that premiered in New York. And I have no proof, but I really have no doubt that Orson saw that cut of Que Viva Mexico.
Yes, I discussed that with Naum Kleiman, who was the director of the Eisenstein Museum, because I read somewhere that after watching this cut, Orson wrote a letter to Eisenstein about the film, about Que Viva Mexico. And Naum told me that he couldn't find this letter in the Eisenstein archives, but he didn't doubt it that Orson, because he has this, he agrees with you and with me. Watching the footage, the Jangadeiros footage, it's quite obvious that Welles have seen the Que Viva Mexico.
Yes,
and was inspired by that. But the
I'm very
correspondent,
impressed hearing about the letter, though. That's new to me. It's
yeah,
quite exciting. But I would also point out, this is sometime before we started shooting, I happened to re-see John Ford's The Hurricane, which was 1938. And watching the island and the beach scenes in The Hurricane, it was also transparently obvious to me that Orson had seen that film as well.
yeah. And knowing that also
There's an incredible correspondence between some shots in The Hurricane and shots that were in the It's All True footage.
And I think we can quote Welles here, that he told that the two leading filmmakers were John Ford, and John Ford, right?
Yes, but everybody forgets the rest of what he said, which is terribly important. It was on the Dick Cavett show, who asked him his three favorite directors.
Yeah, that's it.
And Orson's answer is beyond all criticism from my perspective. He answered John Ford, and John Ford, except for Jean Renoir, who is next to God, and D.W. Griffith, who is God.
That's marvelous. I want to ask one more thing about the importance of the films for Welles, because let's briefly stay in Brazil to finish shooting It's All True against the will of Arcaro, while the magnificent Amazon was being destroyed by the new executives of the studio, was the turning point in Welles' career. My point is, he could easily take a plane, leave Brazil, go back to LA, and tell the guys, "Oh, let me work with you and try to save the film." He didn't do that. And one of the reasons why he didn't do that was that while he was shooting here, we had the tragic death of Jacaré. And I think Welles felt that he had to finish the film like an homage to Jacaré.
Oh, I think it was deeper than a mere homage. I think he wanted to privilege the mission of Jacare and communicate it to the world. He wanted to be sure that the world knew what Jacare had been fighting for. And, one cannot discount a certain degree of guilt as a motivation. And I have to say that in my own mind, and I believe this is true of Bill also, when we went to Brazil, our primary purpose in shooting in Brazil was to convey what Orson wanted to tell the world about Brazilian culture and about the injustices under the regime. And that's why we spent so much time talking to the Jangadeiros and their families, was in a sense to complete the story and bring it up to date. Now, there's an enormous amount of footage, some of it incredibly moving and informative, that we shot in Fortaleza that is not in the film, including many important points I wanted to make. There's an exceptionally moving interview with a man whose father was conscripted into the Navy for Brazil to fight in the war and was killed at sea. And in order to relate the price that individual Brazilians paid for their participation in the war, as an indirect consequence of Orson's mission, was extraordinarily important. Another thing that was in nearly the end of the cut that I found terrifically important was how much, at least in 1993, the branding of the jangada and its use to sell products and as emblems and as symbols was so widespread for commercial purposes, while at the same time, the Jangadeiros' welfare and their culture was being allowed to die out. I wish to make this point far more strongly in the film. We had the footage to do it, but between deadlines and opposition from the French who say, who cares about the poor, it's all the same. An attitude that made me very angry. That is not in the finished film. But it was part of our sense of mission. This is a bit of vanity and puffing ourselves up. But we like to think that we were carrying on the good work regarding Brazil that Orson wished to do. And to the extent that we failed, we were being cursed in the same way and the same reason that he had been.
You didn't fail. You didn't fail.
All right. Well,
you didn't fail.
If we succeeded in conveying that, that would satisfy me that we did what we should have. To the extent we achieved that goal, I have my doubts, but that would be the most important thing we could have done with the footage. Now, I just would like to add a fairly obvious point, but it needs to be made, which is the way we cut the Jangadeiro film, Four Men on a Raft, has zero relationship to how Orson Welles would have cut it. It is not in any respect an Orson Welles cut. First of all, Orson wouldn't have spent anywhere near 20 minutes on it. He would have narrated it and he would have moved through it very quickly, and he would have tied it all together, and he wouldn't linger on shots the way we do. His rhythms would have been almost antithetical to what we did, because our purpose was different. We were primarily motivated on showcasing as much of the footage that he shot and putting it on display, in a sense, as a museum exhibit, but in order to expose people to as many shots of Orson's as we possibly could, consistent with making a coherent and entertaining picture. So we linger on things and we stretch things out because we want to show the diversity of shots that Welles composed, while not sacrificing coherence and rhythm. But it is a rhythm that it is virtually contrary to Welles' sensibility.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Myron, because some of the criticism about the film that I read, and it is really unfair, was that your film, that the 1993 documentary, was not faithful to the material. That you are not. That Orson Welles would have done it differently.
Well, those are two different things.
But these are two different things. Yeah, that's the point. You are not trying to do the film that Welles could have done, or would have done. You are doing another film.
If we had tried to do that, everyone would have hated it,
yeah.
including us.
Yeah, because it's the same old debate about the Que Viva Mexico, because there's quite a few versions of the Que Viva Mexico.
And to be honest with you, I like all of them. They're not the same, but they all have their virtues.
Yeah, but none of them is the film that Sergei Eisenstein would have done.
Of course not.
Of course not. As it's impossible to do the it's so true that Orson Welles would have done it.
Well,
but it's important to have listened to you saying that. Please, we were not trying to do that. We are trying to do our film.
Well, we had no real choice, and we understood this from the beginning. I like to think that we are faithful to the material. What we are not is an accurate representation of how Orson Welles would have presented it. Or did we make the least effort to try to do that? We did try to be faithful to the meaning of the footage. And, we had some arguments among ourselves about including some shots. Ed and Bill would say, we have to put this in, it's such a beautiful shot. I say, it's a beautiful shot, but it stops the movie dead. People are watching this and it's like the movie, the entire narrative just pauses for us to look at this shot. We have to move on. We were very conscious that we had to make a viable film for an audience. But when it comes to fidelity to Orson, fidelity is not imitation. Fidelity is honoring intentions, ambitions, and goals. And that I would like to think we did a good enough job of, although personally, I think we could have done better and wish we had. But every filmmaker, well, maybe not every filmmaker, but many are never satisfied with their final cut. There's a very famous story when the Museum of Modern Art was first starting its film programs. Iris Berry was in the front seat of a taxi, and D.W. Griffith had a print of Birth of a Nation, it was Intolerance, in the back seat, and he had a scissors, and he was cutting it in the back of the cab to make it more acceptable to the audience. He still wasn't satisfied it was good enough. Now, I'm going to reveal something I have never spoken of publicly, but during the long period of house arrest during the pandemic, I've had something of a vision of what can be done with some of the valuable outtakes from It's All True. And I have a vision and an ambition of putting together an essay film of indeterminate length that might reveal some of the secrets that they contain. But my point of view is, at the moment, conditions are not such that we even have access to the material. But my attitude is that I have no fear of failure, even if it is the likeliest prospect. It's always the likeliest prospect. But you know, if you fail, you're no worse off than if you had never tried.
Yeah, I hope you have access. I hope to watch your essay, and that will keep It's So True alive, and will honor again the memory and the work of Orson Welles.
And also of the Jangadeiros and of the Brazilian people.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And I need to end this discussion. Unfortunately, I'm very honored. It was a great pleasure to talk with MYRON MEISEL. This conversation will last for some time, I'm sure about this.
Well, I only hope I wasn't too honest with you.
Certainly you were, and I'm thank you for being honest with me and to clarify some points about the production. And I thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us. I know it's not so easy after 2 years of a pandemic to keep a discussion from distance on Zoom. I hope to meet you again in the next time we are going to discuss It's So True, it will be face to face. Thank you so much, MYRON.
Well, Amir, I like to think of you as ubiquitous, and that wherever I go, you might be.
It is not true. I guarantee it is not true. Thank you so much, MYRON.
You know, there is nothing that Orson Welles relished more than a really good lie.
And that's true. That's very true. Thank you so much. Eu agradeço a vocês que nos acompanharam. Essa foi a terceira mesa da Conferência Internacional do Documentário de 2022, a 19ª conferência, que é uma co-realização do É Tudo Verdade com o Itaú Cultural. Muito obrigado. MYRON, thank you so much. Muito obrigado a vocês. Até mais.
É Tudo Verdade 2022, 27º Festival Internacional de Documentários. Os melhores documentários do Brasil e do mundo em mostras competitivas e programas especiais. Gratuito de 31 de março a 10 de abril. Em salas de São Paulo e Rio de Janeiro. E online para todo o país. Confira a programação em www.etudoverdade.com.br.